July 1984, Kentucky. The heat rises in waves from the asphalt of Interstate 65, distorting the air above the northbound lanes. This is the kind of summer day where the humidity clings to your skin, where the sun beats down relentless and unforgiving. The highway hums with its endless rhythm, 18-wheelers barreling north toward Louisville, sedans heading south toward Nashville, the constant drone of tires on pavement that never quite stops, never quite silences. 2.5 miles south of Bowling Green, the highway cuts through Warren County like a scar. On either side, Kentucky stretches out in rolling hills and patches of grass that have turned golden brown under the brutal summer sun. This is a stretch of road meant for movement, for passage, for getting from one place to another without stopping, without looking, without remembering. But on this particular morning, someone stops. Something in the grass catches their eye. Something that doesn't belong in the landscape of gas stations and mile markers and roadside weeds. The traffic continues its endless flow behind them, cars passing at 70 miles per hour, oblivious. But here, in the grassy verge along the northbound lanes, time seems to hold its breath. The realization comes slowly at first, then all at once. This is not debris. Not trash thrown from a passing car, not the remnants of a roadside accident long since cleared away. This is a person, or rather what remains of one. The moment stretches. The highway noise fades into background static. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, this ordinary stretch of Interstate 65 becomes something else entirely. It becomes a crime scene, a mystery, a tomb without a name. The skeletal remains lie partially concealed in the grass. Time and weather have done their work, but fragments remain, clothing fibers clinging to bones, enough to suggest this was once a woman, a young woman. By the looks of it, she wears a long-sleeved blouse in multiple colors: orange, gold, green, brown. The acrylic fabric has survived better than flesh ever could. Red corduroy pants, Levi's brand. The kind of outfit thousands of women wore in the early 1982s. The kind of outfit that tells you nothing about who she was. Authorities arrive. The scene is secured. Photographs are taken. Evidence is collected. And the questions that will echo for the next 40 years. Who is she? How long has she been here? What happened? But the most important question, the one that will haunt investigators for 4 decades, is the simplest one of all. What is her name? Because there is no identification, no wallet, no driver's license, no jewelry with an inscription, nothing to connect these remains to a missing persons report, to a family searching, to a name in a database somewhere. The silence that follows the discovery is profound. It's the silence of a life interrupted, of a story left unfinished, of a name that has been erased. She would be known only as Warren County Jane Doe for 40 years. Nobody knew her name until modern science changed everything. But this story doesn't begin in 1984 or with remains discovered in the grass. This story begins 2 decades earlier in a hospital in Bethesda, Maryland, with the sound of a baby's first cry. On the 20th of April, 1964, Bethesda, Maryland, a baby girl is born. In that moment, that singular, irreplaceable moment, there is hope. There is potential. There is a whole life stretching out ahead like an unwritten book, pages blank and waiting to be filled with joy and sorrow, and all the ordinary moments that make up a human existence. Someone holds this newborn for the first time. Someone counts her fingers and her toes. Someone looks at her face and thinks about the future, about first steps and first words and first days of school, about who she might become. They give her a name, Patricia Armentrout. It's written on a birth certificate in careful handwriting. Patricia Armentrout, born the 20th of April, 1964, in Bethesda, Maryland. These are the facts that anchor her to the world. This is proof that she existed, that she was born, that she mattered. But in 1964, In the complicated landscape of American adoption, names are fluid things. Patricia Armentrout, the name given to her at birth, would not be the name she carried through life, because this baby girl entered the adoption system. She became someone else's daughter. She took someone else's name. The name Patricia Armentrout disappeared into sealed files and confidential records, buried in the bureaucracy of closed adoptions. For most of her life, she would be known by a different name entirely, a name that, to this day, remains unknown. Think about that for a moment. Imagine your entire identity split in two. Imagine the name you were born with, the first name anyone ever called you, locked away in files you can't access. Imagine growing up never knowing that somewhere, in a hospital in Maryland, a birth certificate exists with a different name. Your name. Your original name. Now imagine disappearing. And imagine that the only way anyone could ever find you again would be through that birth name, the one you never knew you had. That's the tragedy at the heart of Patricia Armentrout's story. We don't know her adoptive family's name. We don't know where she grew up. We don't know if she had siblings, or what her favorite color was, or what she wanted to be when she grew up. We don't know if she was happy. We don't know if she felt loved. We don't know if she ever learned she was adopted, or if she searched for her birth family, or if she ever wondered about the name Patricia Armentrout. Her entire childhood birthday parties and scraped knees and school plays and summer vacations, all of it has been reduced to a blank space in the historical record. All of it erased. Imagine your own childhood. The memories that define you. The moments that shaped who you became. The people who knew you when you were young and saw you grow. Now imagine all of that, every single memory, every photograph, every story, reduced to nothing, to silence, to a name on a birth certificate that no one would see for 60 years. That's what happened to Patricia. By the early 1982, Patricia Armentrout, living under her unknown adoptive name, had reached young adulthood. She would have been around 20 years old, the age when life opens up, when possibilities feel endless, when the future seems full of promise. But somewhere around this time, she faded from the records. In the early 1982, it wasn't hard to disappear. There was no social media to track your every move, no GPS in your pocket broadcasting your location, no digital footprints left behind with every purchase, every phone call, every check-in. If you wanted to drift away from your old life, you could. If you needed to run, you could run. For reasons we may never fully understand, Patricia drifted away from whatever life she'd been living. Maybe she was running from something. Maybe she was running towards something. Maybe she simply got lost along the way so many young people do when they're trying to figure out who they are and where they belong. We don't know if she left voluntarily or if something or someone took her away from the life she knew. We don't know if she was frightened or hopeful or desperate. We don't know if she had a plan or if she was simply following the wind. What we do know is this. Somewhere along that drift, somewhere in the vast geography between Maryland and Kentucky, between birth and death, between being someone and being no one, Patricia's path crossed with Interstate 65, and somewhere along that highway, in the hot summer of 1984, her story ended, or at least, that's when the world stopped knowing who she was. For the next 40 years, Patricia Armentrout would cease to exist, not just dead but erased, forgotten, reduced to bones and clothing fibers and a case number that grew colder with each passing year. And somewhere along that drift, her path crossed with Interstate 65. What happened next would remain a mystery for 4 decades. When the authorities arrive at that stretch of Interstate 65, they're faced with a puzzle that has no easy answers. The remains are skeletal, which means significant time has passed since death. Weeks, certainly. Possibly months. The Kentucky summer heat accelerates decomposition, and the elements have done their work. But even in death, even reduced to bone and fabric, she leaves clues. The investigators work methodically. This is what they do. They take tragedy and break it down into evidence. They photograph. They measure. They document. They try to find the thread that will lead them back to a name, to a family, to answers. The clothing tells them something. The multicolor blouse, orange, gold, green, brown acrylic fibers, woven together in a pattern that was fashionable in its time. The red corduroy Levi pants, the kind you could buy at any department store in America in the early 1982. These are not designer clothes, not unique or custom-made. They're ordinary, the kind of outfit thousands of young women wore to work or school or out with friends, which means they tell the investigators almost nothing about who she was. The remains are transported to the medical examiner. This is where science takes over, where bones are measured and analyzed, where dental records are cataloged, where the dead, if we're lucky, can speak. The first assessment comes back. The victim is female, likely between 12 and 16 years old. This is the first mistake. Not intentional, not careless, just wrong. Because estimating age from skeletal remains is as much art as science, especially when those remains have been exposed to the elements. Growth plates can be misleading. Bone density can lie. The margin of error is wider than anyone wants to admit. She wasn't 12 to 16. She was approximately 20 years old. A young woman, not a teenage girl. But the investigators don't know this yet. And that mistake, that single miscalculation, will send them searching in all the wrong places for years to come. The dental examination reveals more. She had fillings, dental work that suggests she'd had access to some level of health care, at least at some point in her life. The bottom teeth show enamel hypoplasia, a developmental defect that leaves horizontal lines or grooves in the tooth enamel. It's the kind of detail that could help identify her, if only they knew who they were looking for. And then there's the injury, an old healed wound at the back of the skull, not fresh, not related to her death. Something that happened years before a fall, perhaps, or an accident. Another clue that should matter. Another detail that should lead somewhere. But it doesn't, because without a name, without a missing persons report that matches, these clues are just isolated facts floating in a void. They're pieces of a puzzle scattered across a table with no picture to guide the assembly. The search for her identity begins in earnest. Missing persons reports are pulled from files across Kentucky, then from neighboring states, then from further afield. Detectives start with local cases. Young women reported missing from the Bowling Green area, from Warren County, from anywhere within reasonable driving distance of where she was found. They compare physical descriptions, height, build, age estimates, hair color, as much as can be determined from what remains. Nothing matches. They move outward. Tennessee, Indiana, Ohio. The search expands like ripples in water, growing wider and weaker with each iteration. Still nothing. The dental records are entered into databases. Odontologists, forensic dentists, compare her teeth to every missing person's case they can access. They're looking for that one perfect match. That moment when the pattern of fillings and the enamel hypoplasia and the shape of the roots align with someone who's been reported missing. It never comes. Somewhere, someone must be missing her. That's what the investigators tell themselves. A 20-year-old woman doesn't just disappear without someone noticing, without someone filing a report, without a mother or a father or a sister or a friend picking up the phone and saying, "She's gone. Please help us find her." But if someone filed that report, it's under a name the investigators don't know, under a name that will remain hidden for 40 more years. The first reconstruction is attempted. An artist works with the skull, building up clay to approximate what her face might have looked like. It's an imperfect process, part science, part educated guess. The thickness of tissue varies from person to person. The shape of the nose, the set of the eyes, the curve of the lips, all of these require assumptions. The reconstruction is released to the public. Newspapers run the story. Local television stations show the clay bust on the evening news. The tip line rings. People call in with suggestions, with possibilities, with women who went missing and were never found. Every lead is followed. Every tip is investigated. Every single one leads nowhere. And so she becomes Warren County Jane Doe. Case number filed. Evidence stored. Photographs archived. She joins the growing list of unidentified remains, the nameless dead who haunt the margins of police databases and morgue storage facilities. A case file is opened. It's thin at first, just the initial reports, the autopsy findings, the dental records. But over time, it will grow thicker. More tips, more dead ends, more investigators who take over the case when the previous ones retire or transfer or simply give up. But thickness doesn't mean progress. Sometimes a thick file just means years of getting nowhere. The investigation continues for months, then a year, then two. The urgency fades. New cases demand attention. Resources are redirected. The detective assigned to Warren County Jane Doe moves on to fresher crimes, to cases where the trail hasn't gone completely cold. And then the case goes cold. Not officially. There's no stamp that says, unsolved, abandoned, no memo that declares the investigation closed. It just fades. The file sits on a shelf. The evidence stays in storage. The reconstructed face gathers dust in a basement somewhere. Warren County Jane Doe becomes one of thousands of forgotten names, or rather, forgotten non-names. One of thousands of people who died without anyone knowing who they were. For decades, she waits. Each clue should have led somewhere. The clothing, the dental work, the old skull injury, the location where she was found. Each piece of evidence should have been the thread that unraveled the mystery. Instead, they led nowhere, and the woman who was born Patricia Armentrout remained lost in the gap between her birth name and her lived name. Invisible, unidentifiable, gone. 1,984 becomes 1,985, then 1,990, then 2,000. The world moves on. It always does. In Warren County, Kentucky, people stop talking about the woman found along I-65. New tragedies replace old ones. New mysteries demand attention. Life continues its forward momentum, indifferent to the unsolved and the forgotten. But in a storage facility somewhere, in a filing cabinet in a police department, in the records of a medical examiner's office, she remains, not forgotten by everyone, just by most people. The investigators who worked her case in those early years carry her with them. Some of them retire. Some transfer to different departments, different cities. Some leave law enforcement altogether. But they remember. They remember the clay reconstruction. They remember the dental charts. They remember the feeling of hitting wall after wall after wall. Some cases haunt you. Some faces, even reconstructed ones, never leave. New investigators inherit the file. They read through the reports. They look at the photographs. They see the same dead ends their predecessors saw. They make the same calls. They check the same databases. They hope that maybe this time, with fresh eyes, something will click into place. It doesn't. In the early 1990 seconds, computer databases begin to revolutionize police work. Missing persons cases that once lived only on paper in scattered filing cabinets across the country start getting digitized. Information becomes searchable. Connections become possible in ways they never were before. Warren County Jane Doe is entered into these early systems. Her description, her dental records, the circumstances of her discovery. The hope is that somewhere, in some other jurisdiction, someone entered a missing persons report that will finally match. The computer searches, it compares, it cross-references. Still nothing. The internet arrives. By the late 1990 seconds and early 2000s, the world of unidentified remains transforms again. Websites emerge. The Doe Network, NamUs, dedicated specifically to matching unidentified bodies with missing persons. Amateur sleuths begin combing through cases, looking for patterns, suggesting connections. Warren County Jane Doe gets her own entries. Her case is written up. The details are listed. Female, estimated 12 to 16 years old. Still wrong. Found July 1984. Multicolor blouse, red corduroy Levi pants, dental work, old skull injury. People theorize. They suggest names. They compare her description to missing women from the 1982nd. They create threads on message boards, diving deep into the mystery of who she might have been. Every suggestion is investigated. Every name is checked. Every single one is ruled out. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic reconstruction bring new hope. A clay bust is created using more sophisticated techniques. Artists work with forensic anthropologists to create a more accurate representation of what she might have looked like in life. The new reconstruction is released to the media. Once again, newspapers run the story. Once again, the tip line receives calls. Once again, nothing comes of it. In 2013, another reconstruction. This time, using computer modeling combined with traditional methods. The technology has improved. The techniques are more refined. The face that emerges is different from the previous attempt's softer features. A different nose, a subtle shift in the positioning of the eyes. The publicity cycle repeats. Local news, regional news, true crime blogs pick up the story. The hope is that someone, somewhere, will see this face and recognize her. Maybe a former classmate, maybe a distant relative, maybe someone who knew her in passing 40 years ago and will suddenly remember, wait, that looks like. The tips come in. They're investigated. They lead nowhere. In 2018, another reconstruction. The process has become almost routine now. Create a new face. Release it to the public. Wait for the tips. Follow the leads. Watch them evaporate. Each cycle follows the same pattern. Hope builds with each new reconstruction. Maybe this time, maybe this face will be the one that finally sparks recognition. Maybe this is the version that looks enough like her that someone who knew her will see it and come forward. But each time, the hope fades. The publicity dies down. The case goes quiet again, and she remains Warren County Jane Doe. Still nameless, still unclaimed, still lost. While the world moved on, while technology advanced and decades passed, and the 1980 seconds became ancient history, she remained frozen in time. Frozen in that moment of discovery on Interstate 65. Frozen in the photographs taken at the scene. Frozen in the reconstructed faces that might or might not look like her. She was buried, eventually, not cremated, not kept indefinitely in a medical examiner's storage. Someone made the decision that she deserved a grave, even without a name. Somewhere in Kentucky, there's a headstone. Maybe it says Jane Doe. Maybe it says unknown female. 1984. Maybe it just has a case number. But it doesn't say Patricia Armentrout, because for 40 years, Patricia Armentrout didn't just not exist. She had never existed at all. Think about what that means. To be so thoroughly erased that even your death can't restore your identity. To have your name locked away in adoption records while your body lies unidentified in a grave. To have people working for decades to figure out who you are, and never getting close because they're looking for one name while you were born with another. To die twice. Once in body, once in memory. Her case becomes one of thousands, because America has thousands of unidentified remains, thousands of Jane and John Does scattered across the country in morgues and cemeteries and evidence storage facilities. Thousands of people who died without anyone knowing their names. Some are murder victims. Some are accident victims. Some are suicides. Some simply died alone and were never reported missing. Each one represents a failure to identify, a failure to notify family, a failure to provide the most basic dignity of being known. Patricia's case represents all of them. Every unidentified body is someone's daughter, someone's son, someone's sister, or brother, or parent, or friend. Every Jane Doe is a person whose life mattered, whose death should matter, whose name deserves to be remembered. But for 40 years, no one knew Patricia's name. The detectives aged. The case files yellowed. The evidence sat in storage, untouched, except for the occasional review when a new investigator took over the case, or when a new tip came in that needed to be checked. The reconstructions, all of them sat in archives. Multiple versions of the same woman, each one slightly different. Each one a guess at what she might have looked like. Multiple faces for one nameless person. The years accumulated. 1,984 became distant history. The people who might have seen something suspicious that summer were aging, dying, forgetting. Witnesses disappear over time. Memories fade. The trail grows colder and colder until it's not even a trail anymore, just ice. By the time the 2020 seconds arrived, Warren County Jane Doe had been unidentified longer than she'd been alive. She was approximately 20 years old when she died. She'd been nameless for 40 years. The mathematics of tragedy. But in the 2020 seconds, something changed. Not in Warren County, not in Kentucky, but in laboratories across the country, where scientists were developing new techniques to extract DNA from old remains, where forensic genealogists were building family trees from genetic profiles, where the impossible was becoming possible. Science was about to rewrite everything. After 40 years of silence, Patricia Armentrout was about to speak. But before we get to the breakthrough, we need to understand the dead ends. Because for every cold case that gets solved, there are years, sometimes decades, of chasing ghosts, of following leads that evaporate, of being so close to the truth that you can almost taste it, only to discover you were never close at all. The investigation into Warren County Jane Doe wasn't just 40 years of silence. It was 40 years of trying, 40 years of mistakes and miscalculations and assumptions that seemed reasonable at the time but sent everything off course. Let's start with the age. When those remains were first examined in 1984, the assessment came back. 12 to 16 years old. A teenage girl. Maybe a runaway. Maybe a victim of abduction. The age estimate seemed solid enough based on the skeletal analysis. Growth plates. Bone density. The standard metrics used to determine age from remains. So investigators began searching for missing teenage girls. They pulled reports from across Kentucky. They expanded outward to neighboring states. They focused on cases where girls between 12 and 16 had disappeared in the months or years before July 1984. They were meticulous. They were thorough. They compared dental records. They looked at physical descriptions. They contacted families whose daughters had vanished, asking painful questions, chasing down painful possibilities. And they found nothing. Because they were looking for the wrong person. She wasn't 12 to 16. She was approximately 20 years old. A young woman, not a girl. That miscalculation, that single error in age estimation, sent the entire investigation down the wrong path for years. Decades, even. By the time the age estimate was corrected, how much time had been lost? How many viable leads had been missed? Because investigators were focused on the wrong demographic. It's nobody's fault. Estimating age from skeletal remains is difficult under the best circumstances, but the consequences of that error rippled outward through the decades. Every missing persons comparison made using the wrong age was a wasted effort. Every family contacted about a missing teenager was a wrong turn. Years. Wasted years searching for a teenage girl who never existed. Then there's the geography. She was found in Kentucky, in Warren County, along Interstate 65, just south of Bowling Green. The natural assumption, the logical assumption, is that she must be from Kentucky, or at least from somewhere nearby. So that's where the search concentrated. Kentucky missing persons, Tennessee, Indiana, maybe Ohio, the states surrounding where she was found. It made sense. Most murder victims are killed close to where they lived. Most bodies are dumped within a reasonable distance of the crime scene. The idea that someone would transport a body hundreds of miles seemed less likely than the possibility that she was local. But she wasn't local. She was born in Bethesda, Maryland, 600 miles away from where she was found. And after her adoption, who knows where she lived? Maybe she stayed on the East Coast. Maybe she moved to the Midwest. Maybe she traveled constantly, without knowing her adoptive family name, without knowing anything about her life. Between 1,964 and 1,984, there's no way to map her movements. Interstate 65 runs from Gary, Indiana, all the way down to Mobile, Alabama. It cuts through the heart of America. Thousands of people travel it every day. Truckers making long hauls, families on vacation, people relocating from one city to another, drifters with no particular destination in mind. She could have been from anywhere along that route, or from nowhere near it. She could have been traveling with someone. She could have been hitchhiking. She could have been running away or running toward something. The assumption that she was local was reasonable. But it was wrong, and it meant that for decades, investigators were searching Kentucky records when the answer lay in Maryland adoption files that no one knew to look for. Then there's the clothing, the multicolor blouse, orange, gold, green, brown acrylic fibers, the red corduroy Levi pants. These should have been clues. Clothing can tell you about economic status, about style preferences, about when and where someone might have purchased their wardrobe. But these clothes told investigators almost nothing useful, because they were common, generic, the kind of outfit you could buy at any J. Penny or Sears in America. In the early 1982s, Levi's were everywhere. Multicolor blouses were fashionable. Investigators tried. They contacted Levi's to see if they could narrow down when and where that particular style of red corduroy pants was sold. They looked at the blouse, trying to determine if it was a specific brand that might have limited distribution. Dead end after dead end. Thousands of women wore similar outfits. The clothing was too ordinary to be distinctive, too common to be traceable. It was a clue that should have helped. Instead, it was just another frustration, just another detail that led nowhere. And then there are the missing persons reports, or rather, the lack thereof. When someone goes missing, their family typically files a report. Name, physical description, last known location, circumstances of disappearance. These reports go into databases. They get compared against unidentified remains. Investigators compared Warren County Jane Doe to hundreds of missing persons reports. They looked at women who had disappeared in the early 1980s. They checked and rechecked, hoping to find that one report where the dental records matched, where the physical description aligned, where everything clicked into place. It never happened. And here's why. She was never reported missing under the name Patricia Armentrout, because she didn't know that was her name, because she lived her entire life under her adoptive family name, a name we still don't know. And if her adoptive family reported her missing, they would have used that name. The name on her driver's license, the name on her school records, the name everyone who knew her would have called her, not Patricia Armentrout. So when investigators searched missing persons databases for Patricia Armentrout, they found nothing, because that name didn't exist in their databases. It existed only on a birth certificate filed away in Maryland, disconnected from the woman who died in Kentucky. This is the unique tragedy of her case. She was missing. Someone, somewhere, should have been looking for her. Maybe they were. Maybe her adoptive family filed a report. Maybe they spent years searching, years wondering what happened to their daughter. But the report they filed, if they filed one, was under a different name. A name that couldn't be connected to the remains found on I-65 because the connection between her birth name and her lived name had been severed by adoption. She fell through the gap between identities. The detectives who worked this case over the decades carried this weight with them. The frustration of knowing that somewhere there must be answers, but being unable to find them. The exhaustion of chasing lead after lead only to watch them dissolve into nothing. Some of them retired still thinking about her, still wondering, still hoping that maybe someday someone would figure it out. Cold cases are called cold for a reason, not because no one cares, but because the trail has gone so cold that there's nothing left to follow. Every lead has been exhausted. Every witness has been interviewed. Every database has been searched, and still nothing. That's where Warren County Jane Doe sat for decades, in the coldest part of the cold case files. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but unsolvable. At least, that's what it seemed like. Until science offered a new path forward, until DNA technology advanced to the point where bones that had been sitting in storage for 40 years could suddenly tell a story they'd never been able to tell before, until the impossible became possible. But before we talk about the science that changed everything, we need to understand what this case meant, not just to investigators, not just to databases and case files, but to real people, to communities, to families searching for missing loved ones across America. Because every unidentified body sends ripples outward, ripples that touch more lives than you might imagine. Bowling Green, Kentucky, in 1984, was not a place where things like this happened. It's a small city, the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where violent crime feels distant and abstract, where the most dangerous thing on most people's minds is the traffic on I-65. When news broke that skeletal remains had been found along the highway, the community reacted the way small communities always do when tragedy arrives on their doorstep. With shock, with fear, with a sudden, acute awareness that terrible things can happen anywhere. Local newspapers ran the story on the front page. Local television stations led with it on the evening news. And in living rooms across Warren County, parents held their children a little tighter. Wives called their husbands to make sure they'd arrived safely at work. Women who had to travel alone on I-65 felt a spike of anxiety every time they passed that stretch of highway. Because if it could happen to her, whoever she was, it could happen to anyone. The fear was palpable in those early weeks. Who did this? Were they still out there? Was this a random killing or something more targeted? Would there be more bodies? Over time, the fear faded. It always does. New stories replaced old ones. Life continued. People stopped thinking about the woman found on the highway every time they drove past that spot. But the case remained. Unsolved. Unidentified. A lingering question mark in the community's collective memory. For 40 years, that question mark stayed there. A reminder that some mysteries don't get solved. That some questions don't get answered. That sometimes evil happens and no one ever pays for it. But the impact of Patricia's case extends far beyond Bowling Green, far beyond Kentucky, because her story is part of a much larger crisis, one that most people don't even know exists. Right now, at this moment, there are thousands of unidentified remains in America, thousands of Jane and John Does scattered across the country in morgues and medical examiners' offices and cemetery plots marked only with case numbers. Some have been unidentified for months, some for years, some, like Patricia, for decades. Each one represents a failure of the system, a failure to connect a body with a missing persons report, a failure to identify through dental records or fingerprints or DNA, a failure to provide the most basic dignity, a name. But more than that, each one represents a family searching. Somewhere, for almost every unidentified body, there's a mother or a father or a sibling or a child who doesn't know what happened to their loved one, who files missing persons reports that never get matched, who waits by the phone hoping for news that never comes. This is the hidden tragedy, the compounding grief. On one side, you have the unidentified dead. On the other side, you have the families of the missing, and in between, There's a gap, a failure to connect the two. Organizations have emerged to address this crisis. The Doe Network, founded in 1999, is run by volunteers who comb through unidentified cases and missing persons reports, looking for potential matches. NAMUS, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, was created in 2007 as a centralized database to make these comparisons easier. And then there's the DNA Doe Project, founded in 2017, which uses forensic genealogy to identify unknown remains. They've helped solve hundreds of cases, hundreds of Jane and John Does who finally got their names back. Patricia's case is one of them, but she's also representative of the thousands who are still waiting, still unidentified, still lost in that gap between death and identification. Every identification matters, not just for the individual, but for what it represents. It represents hope for other families, proof that even decades-old cases can be solved, evidence that science is catching up to tragedy. When one Jane Doe is identified, it reminds the world that these aren't just case numbers. These are people, people who lived, people who loved and were loved, people whose deaths should not erase their identities. Patricia's case has another layer of complexity: adoption. The adoption system, particularly in the 1,960 seconds when Patricia was born, was designed around confidentiality. Birth records were sealed. Adoptees often didn't know their birth names. Birth parents didn't know what happened to their children after adoption. This was seen as protection at the time. Protection for birth mothers from stigma. Protection for adoptive families from interference. Protection for adoptees from the complicated emotions of dual identities. But when someone disappears, when someone dies unidentified, that confidentiality becomes a barrier, a wall between the person and their identity. Patricia Armentrout lived her entire life under a different name. If her adoptive family reported her missing, they would have used that name. If her birth family wondered what happened to her, they only knew her as Patricia Armentrout, a name she may never have known herself. The adoption records were sealed. The connection between her birth name and her lived name existed only in confidential files that no one thought to access. Because why would they? She was Warren County Jane Doe, found in Kentucky. There was no obvious reason to search Maryland adoption records from 1,964. This is the unique challenge of adoptee cases. The paper trail is intentionally broken. The connection between birth identity and lived identity is hidden by design, which raises difficult questions. Did Patricia's birth family know she'd gone missing? Did they spend 40 years wondering what happened to the baby girl they'd given up for adoption in 1,964? Did they ever imagine that she died young, died violently, died without anyone knowing her name? Did her adoptive family file a missing persons report under her lived name? Did they search for her? Did they grieve her disappearance for decades, never knowing that she'd been found in Kentucky, never knowing that she was lying unidentified just a few states away? Or had she lost touch with both families? Had she drifted so far from her roots, both biological and adoptive, that no one filed a report at all? These questions may never be fully answered. Even now that she's been identified, there are pieces of the story that remain blank. Names we don't know, connections we can't trace. But what we do know is this: for 40 years, Patricia Armentrout existed in a space between identities. Born with one name, lived with another, died with neither. She represents not just the crisis of unidentified remains, but the specific challenges faced by adoptees who go missing. The additional layer of complexity when identity itself is split in two. And she represents hope, because if her case could be solved after 40 years, despite all these barriers, despite the sealed records and the name changes and the decades of dead ends, then other cases can be solved too. Every identification is a victory, not just for one person, but for everyone still waiting. Every Jane Doe who gets her name back is proof that the system can work. that science and determination and human compassion can overcome the barriers. Patricia waited 40 years, but she didn't wait in vain. The 2010 seconds changed everything, not overnight, not with a single discovery, but gradually, methodically, science began catching up to the decades-old mysteries that had seemed unsolvable. It started with consumer DNA testing. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com made genetic testing accessible to millions of people. Suddenly, anyone could send in a saliva sample and learn about their ancestry, find distant relatives, discover genetic connections they never knew existed. Most people used these services out of curiosity, to learn about their heritage, to build family trees, to find second cousins twice removed living in states they'd never visited. But investigators saw something else. They saw a database, a massive, ever-growing collection of genetic information that could be used to solve crimes, to identify unknown remains, to finally answer questions that had been unanswerable for decades. The breakthrough case came in 2018, the Golden State Killer. A serial rapist and murderer who had evaded capture for decades was finally identified through forensic genealogy. Investigators uploaded crime scene DNA to a public genealogy database, built a family tree, and narrowed down potential suspects until they found their man. It was revolutionary, and it opened the floodgates. If forensic genealogy could catch a serial killer, it could identify Jane and John Does. It could give names back to the nameless. It could finally bridge that gap between unidentified remains and missing persons reports. But there was a catch. DNA from old remains isn't always usable. Degradation happens. Environmental exposure destroys genetic material. Traditional DNA testing methods often fail when the samples are decades old, when they've been stored improperly, when time and nature have done their corrosive work. That's where companies like Armentrout come in. Founded in 2018, Armentrout specializes in forensic-grade genome sequencing. They use cutting-edge technology to extract DNA from samples that would be useless with traditional methods. Bones that have been buried for decades, teeth exposed to the elements, tissue that's degraded beyond recognition. The process is complex, but here's the simplified version. They extract whatever DNA they can from the remains. They sequence the entire genome, not just the markers used in traditional forensic DNA testing, but hundreds of thousands of genetic variants across the entire genetic code. This creates a detailed genetic profile. Then comes the genealogy work. They upload this profile to genealogy databases filled with millions of people who voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry. The system looks for matches, not exact matches, those are rare, but distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, genetic connections that might seem insignificant on their own but become crucial when you're building a family tree. From there, genealogists go to work. They build family trees backward and forward through generations. They follow branches, trace lineages, narrow down possibilities. They use birth records, marriage records, obituaries, census data, anything that can help map out family connections. Eventually, if everything works, they narrow it down to a small pool of possible identities. Sometimes, just one. Then investigators take over, confirming the identification through additional testing or records. It's painstaking work. It can take months or even years, but it works. Across the country, Armentrout and similar companies have identified hundreds of previously unknown remains. Jane and John Does, who had been nameless for decades, suddenly have their identities restored. In 2022, the Kentucky State Medical Examiner's Office decided to try this new technology on some of their oldest cold cases. Warren County Jane Doe was one of them. Her remains had been in storage for 38 years by that point. Skeletal material, carefully preserved as evidence. For decades, that's all they'd been, evidence in an unsolved case. But now, they were about to become something more. They were about to become a voice from the past. The remains were submitted to Armentrout, The lab went to work. Extracting DNA from bones that old is never guaranteed to work. Sometimes there's not enough genetic material left. Sometimes it's too degraded. Sometimes the sequencing fails. But this time, it worked. Othram successfully created a comprehensive genetic profile from Patricia's remains. After 40 years, her DNA was finally speaking. The genetic profile was uploaded to genealogy databases. The computers went to work, searching through millions of profiles, looking for matches, looking for relatives, looking for connections. They found them, not close relatives. These weren't parents or siblings showing up in the database, but distant cousins. Genetic connections separated by generations but still traceable through the patterns in their DNA. The genealogists built family trees. They traced branches backward through the decades. They followed names through birth certificates and marriage licenses. They constructed elaborate diagrams showing how these distant relatives connected to each other and potentially to Warren County Jane Doe. The work took months. Each lead had to be verified. Each branch of the family tree had to be traced carefully. There were dead ends. There were moments when it seemed like the trail was going cold again, even with this new technology. But the genealogists persisted. They followed the genetic breadcrumbs. They narrowed down the possibilities. And eventually, they found her. They found the name that had been lost for 40 years. October 2024. The confirmation came through. After 40 years of being no one. After 4 decades of existing only as a case number and a set of remains and multiple reconstructed faces that might or might not have looked like her. Warren County Jane Doe finally had a name. Patricia Armentrout. Born the 20th of April 1964 in Bethesda, Maryland. The woman who had been erased was suddenly, miraculously, restored. The Kentucky Medical Examiner's Office made the announcement. Local news picked it up. Then, regional news. Then, national outlets. The story of Warren County Jane Doe solved after 40 years through cutting-edge DNA technology spread across the country. For the investigators who had worked the case. For the ones who had retired still thinking about her. For the ones who had inherited the file and carried her memory. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The answer they'd spent decades searching for. She wasn't from Kentucky. She was from Maryland, 600 miles away. She'd been adopted, which explained why no missing persons report had ever matched. She'd been approximately 20 years old, not a teenager, which explained why all those early searches had failed. Every dead end suddenly made sense. Every frustration had an explanation. Patricia's case became the 8th cold case in Kentucky solved by Othram's forensic genealogy technology. The 8th Jane or John Doe to get their name back. The 8th family to potentially get closure after years or decades of not knowing. But it wasn't just about the numbers. It wasn't just about adding another success to Othram's growing list of identifications. It was about Patricia, about restoring her identity. About proving that even after 40 years, even when every traditional method had failed, even when the case seemed impossible, justice could still be served. Not justice in the legal sense. Not yet. Because identifying her didn't automatically reveal who killed her or why. The investigation into her death was, and still, is ongoing. But justice in a different sense. The justice of being known. The justice of having your name restored. The justice of not being forgotten. For 40 years, Patricia Armentrout had been erased. Now she existed again. And in that moment of identification, after all those decades, she finally had something she'd been denied since July 1984. Her dignity, her identity, her name. But identification, as important as it is, isn't the same as answers. And there were still so many questions left to answer. October 2024. The announcement goes public. After 40 years, Warren County Jane Doe has a name. Patricia Armentrout. The media coverage is immediate. Headlines spread across news sites. 40-year-old cold case solved through DNA. Jane Doe finally identified after 4 decades. Kentucky mystery solved. Woman found on eye 65 inches 1,984. Identified as Patricia Armentrout. For people who had followed the case over the years, the true crime enthusiasts, the amateur sleuths on forums, the locals who remembered when she was first discovered, this is a moment of collective relief. Finally, after all this time, she has a name. But for Patricia herself, if such a thing can be said about someone who died 40 years ago, this moment represents something profound, something almost spiritual. Imagine being erased. Imagine your name, the most fundamental piece of your identity, being stripped away. Imagine existing for 4 decades only as unknown female, or a case number, or a reconstruction that might not even look like you. And then, imagine, suddenly, being restored, being pulled back from that void of anonymity, being named again. Patricia Armentrout, born the 20th of April 1964. A person, a real person with a birth certificate and a history and a name that finally connects to her remains. After 40 years of silence, she can be remembered not as Jane Doe but as who she actually was. Her birth certificate, filed away in Bethesda, Maryland, gathering dust for 60 years, is suddenly relevant again. The name written there, Patricia Armentrout, is no longer just an artifact of a closed adoption. It's a connection, a thread linking past to present, birth to death, identity to remains. The public announcement is careful, respectful. It confirms the identification but doesn't reveal everything, because there are still gaps, still unknowns, still pieces of the story that remain missing. The official statement from the Kentucky Medical Examiner's Office is clear. An investigation into Patricia's death and her final days is ongoing. That word ongoing carries weight. It means this isn't over. Identification is just the beginning. Now comes the harder work, figuring out what happened to her in those final days, how she ended up on Interstate 65, who was responsible for her death. But there's so much we still don't know. We don't know her adoptive name. The name she lived under for her entire life remains unknown, either protected by privacy laws or simply lost in the complexities of the investigation. Without that name, we can't trace her childhood, her education, her friends, her adult life before she disappeared. We don't know where she lived. Bethesda, Maryland, was her birthplace. But after adoption, her path becomes unclear. Did her adoptive family stay in Maryland? Did they move to another state? Did Patricia herself relocate as an adult? The geography of her life between 1,964 and 1,984 is still blank. We don't know what led her to Kentucky. Interstate 65 connects multiple states. Was she traveling? Was she brought there against her will? Was she living in the area? Or was Kentucky just a random point on a longer journey? We don't know how she died. The cause of death has not been publicly released. This is common in ongoing investigations. Certain details are held back, known only to investigators and potentially to the person responsible. But it leaves a significant gap in understanding what happened to her. We don't know if she knew her killer. This is perhaps the most haunting question. Was this random violence, a crime of opportunity, or was Patricia killed by someone she knew, someone she trusted? We don't know if her family's birth or adoptive have been located. Through the genealogical research that identified her, Othram would have built family trees. Those trees might lead to living relatives, but whether those relatives have been contacted, whether they knew Patricia was missing, whether they're even aware of her death, all of that remains private. The investigation continues quietly. Detectives are likely re-examining the original evidence with fresh eyes. They're looking at the case, not as Warren County Jane Doe, but as Patricia Armentrout from Maryland. That shift in perspective might open new avenues of investigation. They might be searching for missing persons reports filed under her adoptive name, They might be interviewing people who knew her, if any can be found. They might be looking at her life in the early 1980 seconds, trying to reconstruct her final weeks or months. But investigations like this take time, especially after 40 years. Witnesses age, memories fade, people move away or die. The trail is cold. Identification makes it warmer, but it doesn't automatically solve the crime. There's also the possibility that new tips will come in. Now that her name is public, now that her story is in the news again, someone who knew something in 1984 might come forward. Someone who saw something along I-65. Someone who remembers Patricia from her adoptive life. Someone who has been carrying a secret for 40 years and finally feels safe enough to speak. Cold cases have been solved this way before. A renewed media push after identification brings witnesses out of the woodwork. Someone who was afraid to talk in 1984 might be willing to talk now. Someone who didn't realize the significance of what they saw might suddenly connect the dots. The breakthrough cases, the ones that get solved decades later, often come from these late witnesses, from people who finally decide to do the right thing. So there's hope, real, tangible hope, that Patricia's case might not just be about identification but about justice, about finding the person responsible for her death, about understanding what happened in those final days. But even if those answers never come, even if the investigation remains ongoing indefinitely, even if we never learn who killed her or why the identification itself matters, because Patricia Armentrout is no longer no one. She's no longer a Jane Doe, a mystery, a blank space in the records. She's a person, a woman with a birth date and a birthplace and a name that belongs to her. Her grave can be marked properly now. Instead of unknown female, 1984, or a case number, her headstone can say her actual name, Patricia Armentrout, the 20th of April, 1964. People can mourn her not as an abstraction but as a real person. They can say her name. They can remember that she lived, even if so much of how she lived remains unknown. And for the investigators who worked her case over the decades, for the ones who never gave up hope that someday she'd be identified, for the ones who carried her memory long after they'd moved on to other cases, this is closure of a sort, not complete closure. Not the closure that comes from solving a case entirely, from bringing someone to justice, from understanding exactly what happened, but the closure that comes from knowing, from no longer having to call her Jane Doe, from finally being able to say, this is Patricia Armentrout, this is who she was, and maybe that's enough. For now, the investigation continues. The questions remain. The gaps in her story are still there, waiting to be filled, but Patricia Armentrout has her name back. After 40 years in the dark, after 4 decades of being nobody, she exists again. And in that existence, there is dignity, there is respect, there is the acknowledgement that her life mattered, her death matters, and her name, that simple, essential piece of identity, deserves to be remembered.